begin.
Should we start?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's a singular privilege and extreme honor to have Dr. Karthick Ram Manoharan discuss his new book with us today. The book is titled Periyar, A Study in Political Atheism. Dr. Karthick Ram Manoharan is Marie-Sklodowska Curie Actions Individual Fellow at the University of Wolverhampton and is the author of Frantz Fanon, Identity and Resistance. Both these books have been published by Orient BlackSwan. A very warm welcome to you to this book discussion. The book will have implications for our understanding not merely of Periyar or the politics of political atheism, but questions of freedom, equality, justice, religion and politics, and many such overlapping themes. So thank you for agreeing to do this. My suggestion in my very limited role as the chair is that would it be all right if you speak for about 30 minutes?
Yes.
And then the two discussants, Dr. Thiru, very warm welcome to you too for agreeing to be a discussant. And Ganeshwar, who is a doctoral scholar with us in the department. Both of you could speak for 20 minutes each, and then we'll throw open the meeting to questions, which I must underline at the very outset must be questions, not monologues or statements. And I look forward to a very exciting afternoon of ideas. Yeah, Sneha.
Before that happens, can I take the liberty of introducing all the panelists slightly more formally and in some detail?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. As Professor Sharma already welcomed all our panelists, I would like to join him on behalf of the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad, for agreeing to come to this discussion. We are very pleased to have Dr. Karthick, who's going to discuss his book, as Professor Sharma said. He also mentioned Dr. Karthick Ram Manoharan's previous book on Frantz Fanon. It may be of interest for everyone who has joined us today, and otherwise to also know that currently he is a fellow at the University of Wolverhampton in the UK, but previously he has also worked as assistant professor at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, and as senior lecturer at the Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. He works on political theory and philosophy, intellectual history, and the identity politics of caste, race, and nation, with a focus on modern South India. Apart from the book, his first book on Frantz Fanon, he has recently also co-edited a volume along with S. Anandi and others titled Rethinking Social Justice. And today we are very pleased to have him with us discuss his newest publication. Thank you very much also to our discussants. One of our discussants is a colleague from the university. Dr. R. Thirunavakarasu is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the university. Before joining the University of Hyderabad, he was Associate Director, Institute of Human Rights Education, Madurai, Tamil Nadu. His work has been in the areas of nation and nationalism, political sociology of caste, and study of social movements with a focus on the context of Tamil Nadu. And his most recent publication is a volume titled Social Hegemony in Contemporary India that he edited and was published by Sage last year in 2021, and in which the speaker today, Dr. Karthick Ram Manoharan, is a contributor. Our second discussant, we are very happy to have him on board, is a second-year PhD student from the Department of Political Science, Ganeshwar. He completed his MPhil at the Department of Political Science at University of Delhi, and he wrote a dissertation titled Region as Non-Brahmin Discursive Space, Rethinking Identity Construction in the Dravidian Movement, analyzing the thought of Pandit Ayutitas, Marai Adigal, and E.V. Ramaswamy Periyar. And our very own, thank you, Professor Sharma, for chairing this. He's our colleague at the department. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science. He works in the area of political theory and political philosophy and has published extensively with several books to his credit. His work has focused on contemporary Hindutva and Hindu nationalism through a focus on Swami Vivekananda, M.S. Golwalkar, and the RSS. And his most recent book being Elusive Nonviolence, The Making and Unmaking of Gandhi's Religion of Ahimsa, which was published last year by Context. Over to you, Professor Sharma. Thank you for letting me do this in between. Yes. You are on mute, Professor Sharma. Yeah.
Thank you for the detailed introduction of all of us. Without much ado, may I now invite Dr. Karthick Ram Manoharan to tell us something about his book. Dr. Karthick, please.
Thank you all. And my thanks to Professor Sharma for being the chair of this book discussion event today. Just want to add that I'm a huge fan of his work, and almost most of what I know of Hindutva is from Professor Sharma's work. So I'm really honored to be discussing my book in front of him today. My thanks to the discussants, Dr. Thirunavakarasu and Ganeshwar, and I would just like to add a little bit of trivia here. Dr. Thirunavakarasu was my teacher when I was an undergrad student. So if he is going to be very critical about my book and if he finds faults with it, sir, it's probably your fault as a teacher. So I'm going to blame it on you. Anyway, so I'm just kidding. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm speaking at the University of Hyderabad after 6 years. The last time I spoke was at the UGC SAP seminar, which was again organized by Dr. Thirunavakarasu in 2016. And thank you very much, Sneha, for coordinating and organizing the event. So very happy to be here, and let me just jump into the discussion right away. And I would like to keep it brief, probably even lesser than 30 minutes, because I would like to hear more of feedback from the discussants, and also, more importantly, the question and answers from the audience. Periyar, as you know, is sort of a central and key figure of Dravidian politics. Very recently, after the DMK won in the 2021 elections, the Tamil Nadu Chief Minister M.K. Stalin commemorated Periyar's birth anniversary as Social Justice Day. Now, Periyar as such is most known, not just in Tamil Nadu, but even outside Tamil Nadu, for his what many people consider are his extreme views on religion, right? So now in Tamil Nadu, in almost in every major city or town you go, you see this statue of this bearded man who looks like a saint. But below the statue, there are these inscriptions. There is no God. He who believes in God is a fool. He who propagates God is a scoundrel, and so on and so forth. Right? So this aspect of his attack on religion, or his rejection of religion, is often brought to the foreground when discussing Periyar. Now, for atheists, that seems to be a very strong selling point, because they view Periyar as one of their own, who rejected the existence of God and who was very sharply critical of religion and so on. On the other hand, it is also the favored beating rod by the religious right, to whom Periyar is anti-Hindu, anti-Brahmin, and by virtue of that, anti-national. Right? And in recent times, there have also been instances of Periyar statues being desecrated in places in Tamil Nadu, allegedly by activists of the Hindu right. In fact, even recently, one low-level Hindu right activist created controversy when he said that the statues of Periyar, which are located near the premises of temples, must be demolished. Now, what provokes this sort of extreme reactions against Periyar, I would say, are not just his criticisms of religion. Periyar himself says in one of his speeches that I am not being criticized because I am criticizing religion. I am being criticized because I'm attacking the edifice of caste, right? So Periyar's criticism of religion, as I tried to show in this book, was not a sort of a simple promotion of atheism or an atheistic approach to life or society as an alternative to religion. No, fundamentally, what I'm trying to argue here, Periyar's criticism of religion is a critique of fundamental form of social power, and more importantly, a critique of political theology. Now, I'll just come to that in a very short while. What Periyar is doing over here, right, as in, there are certain personal experiences in his life which, pushed him towards the rejection of God and religion, right? So from his own, what shall I say, self-narrative or autobiographical statements, he says that one of the key things which made him realize the corruption of religion, ironically, was his stint as a sannyasi, where he wandered to holy sites of Hinduism, and he also stayed for a long time in Kasi. So, where he tried to pass himself off as a one sadhu or a mendicant. And when he saw the sort of corrupt practices inside the temples, he felt aghast, and he felt that some sort of thing must be done to shake up the order of things. Now, this was in the early part of the 20th century. Now, you would also know that this is a time of major social and political ferment all across India. You had reformers talking about political reform, Swaraj, and at the other hand, you had the social reformers who were arguing that social reform or reform related to caste must take precedence over Swaraj. So this was a sort of a very dynamic period in the subcontinent, and especially in Tamil Nadu, you already had a sort of a legacy of anti-caste intellectuals who were sort of setting the terrain for discourse in the state. And in this sort of a scenario, Periyar comes back from his religious tour, if one may say, as a person who's very sharply critical of religion. And initially, he tries to work with the Congress, but when he realizes that they are unwilling to take religious reform or the question of caste very seriously, he breaks away and forms his own self-respect movement. Now, even at this time, Periyar's criticism of religion are not that explicit. He He has become an atheist, but he has still not become what I would call a political atheist, right? So for him in the 1920s, atheism was a sort of a personal choice, right? So another little bit of trivia is that when Periyar floated the self-respect movement, he launched the party newspaper called Kudiyarasu, right, which literally translates to republic. Now, the Kudiyarasu was officially launched by a Saivite believer, a person who believes in Lord Shiva, right? I forget his name, but he was a sort of a prominent Saivite thinker in Tamil Nadu, and he launched Periyar's party paper, the Kudiyarasu, right? So at this point of time, in the 1920s and 1925, Periyar's still not preaching atheism in a sort of a political confrontationist way. He's criticizing religion, but that's about it. What happens is that his commitment to atheism and for the propagation of atheism intensifies after his visit to the Soviet Union, right? So he visits the Soviet Union along with his Lieutenant Ramanathan in 1931-32, and there's a very nice account of Periyar's travel in Europe. So it's not just the Soviet Union. He also visits socialist groups in Germany, France, in the United Kingdom, and so on. So there's a very nice account of that by a chapter of A.R. Venkatachalapati titled, let me just get the title for you. Yeah, it's called From Erode to Volga, Periyar, yes, thank you, sir. Periyar EVR's Soviet and European Tour, 1932. So it's in this volume called India and the World in the first half of the 20th century. So in the Soviet Union, he meets, communist leaders like Stalin, and he also enlists himself in the League of the Militant Godless, and he also pledges his commitment to the propagation of atheism and socialism on his return to India. Right now, many people would know that Periyar began aggressively promoting socialist ideas in the early 30s, but after there was a sort of a crackdown by the British government, and after he was made to serve a sentence, he temporarily gave up the militant promotion of communism, mainly because he believed that one needed to achieve self-respect prior to moving to a stage of socialism. Right? To him, as he says in one of his later articles in the 40s or something, that annihilation of caste is halfway towards communism. So he believed that this had to take a sort of a priority or a primary contradiction, if you want to use a Maoist term, if you would like. So what Periyar does is that he strategically suspends his association with communism for a temporary period. But I would say throughout his life, he was sympathetic to some or other form of socialism. Now, there have been attempts to read Periyar within a sort of a Marxist trajectory. And there are scholars, especially those based in Tamil Nadu, who have tried to read Periyar as a sort of a crude Marxist, or someone whose thoughts we could probably conceive of a Periyarist Marxism. But my own reading of Periyar's works suggests that though he makes a lot of statements sympathetic to socialism, or particularly the Soviet variety of socialism, I think that in essence, Periyar or Periyarism is a lot closer to anarchism, mainly because of the central importance it gives to freedom. So one of my arguments, which I'm coming to in this book, is that Periyarism is a sort of a radical conception of freedom, right? So in a sense, it is freedom from God, it is freedom from casteism, freedom from patriarchy, freedom from oppression. Now, all of these are negative liberties, but also it is freedom towards rationalism, freedom towards egalitarianism, freedom towards individual and collective emancipation. So that's positive liberty as well. So I would say that given his emphasis on freedom or vidudalai as the corresponding Tamil word in his corpus, I would like to place Periyarism as being closer in familial terms to anarchism than to Marxism as such. So from this stems my idea that Periyarism is a form of political atheism, because as I argue in my book, it is a critique of all forms of political theology. Though his focus in India or in his context is Brahmanism, I would say Periyarism as such is a critique of all forms of political theology. Now, what is political theology? So, political theology is a term which was popularized by the German political theorist Carl Schmitt. And to sum it up very clearly, it is, as he puts it very powerfully, it is secularized theological concepts, right? So, when the conception of good and evil, which are theological concepts, right? They didn't exist prior to theology. But when these are secularized and they are brought to the plane where one is categorized as friend or enemy, and by virtue of that good or evil, this becomes a sort of a secularized theological concept. And Carl Schmitt argues that this is fundamental to the modern state and politics in and of the modern state. Now, in a sense, Carl Schmitt was responding to certain currents in the German society when he wrote this book in the 20s, I believe. Yeah. So, while he is attacking the liberal apoliticism, his concern, or rather his intellectual curiosity, was stimulated by the leftists and especially the anarchists. Now, there are Carl Schmitt scholars who would tell you that political theology, his work on political theology, was a response not so much to the rise of communism in Russia, but to the specific doctrine of Mikhail Bakunin, the anarchist, right? Because Mikhail Bakunin, prior to Carl Schmitt, had written a small tract called The Political Theology of Mazzini, where he criticizes the nationalism and the attachment to state of the Italian nationalists. And he criticizes that, in a sense, whatever is being talked of as modern nationalism or modern statism is nothing but a secularization, or putting in secular terms, of a faith in God or divinity, right? So in a sense, what Bakunin was saying is that statism, or the belief that the state is important and the only is the important and if not the only avenue for politics. Now Bakunin contests this and says that this is just the replacement of God with Caesar, right? Now Periyar, while he is not talking about this in such explicit terms, because you can see in the course of his career that he was willing to work or negotiate with the state, right? So he was very sympathetic to the rule of K. Kamaraj, the Congress chief minister, and later he was also sympathetic to the rule of C.N. Annadurai and Karunanidhi, mainly because he thought that within such leaders like Kamaraj, Annadurai, or Karunanidhi, there was a possibility of social reform, especially regarding the representation of marginalized castes and communities within the administrative structure. But that was not all. Periyar was critical throughout the process. While he was supporting people like Kamaraj, Anna, or Kalaignar Karunanidhi, he was also very sharply critical of what he believed was the limitations of a state-centric approach. So, which is why he tells that he emphasizes that a rationalist should have no commitment to country, religion, nation, language, caste, God, anything whatsoever, and that the concern for a rationalist should be only humanity. So this, in a sense, puts him a bit differently from the other anti-caste thinkers in South India or other parts of India at that time, because he did not, he was critical not just of religion and nationalism, but of the nation state as such, right? So likewise, there are places, where why Periyar is called anti-nationalist, because he allegedly supported the separation of Tamil Nadu and so on. But I would say that this was never a sort of a serious commitment, because Periyar was as critical of Tamil nationalism as he was of Indian nationalism. So in a sense, his idea of Dravidian or Dravidianism is a sort of a very fluid and a non-state category. It's a sense, I would say, a sort of a community founded on certain non-hierarchical, undefined principles. Now, this being undefined might be its weakness, but in a sense, it also gives it a remarkable element of fluidity, which makes it difficult for us to pin down Periyar to any particular constituency or any limited sort of an approach. So now this reflects in his approach to religion as well. This very strongly reflects in his approach to religion, this political atheist approach. So when he is, for instance, when he is criticizing the Ramayana, for instance, right? So he is not necessarily, denying the existence of Rama or denying the miracles which happen in the Ramayana, nor is he affirming the historical presence of Ravana, right? So what he's trying to do is that, you see, at that point of time, Lord Rama was seen both by secular nationalists as well as Hindu nationalists as a sort of a moral exemplar whose icon was, in a sense, juxtaposed with the ideal of the Indian nation, right? Now, belief is something different altogether. There are thousands of communities which believe in Rama God without necessarily politicizing him. But when Periyar was speaking what he was speaking against the Ramayana, Lord Rama was already politicized, right? So you had the Hindu right, and you also had liberal Hindus projecting Ram not just as a divine figure, but also as a political figure and as a political model for emulation. Now, if you read the work of Upinder Singh on ancient India, we also know that figures like Lord Rama were never apolitical, were never depoliticized. They always had political meaning to legitimize the authority of the state and of the monarchy in many parts of India. So in a sense, what Periyar is placing on the Ramayana is not some crude criticism, making fun of the text or telling that how could this have happened? Is it possible for, this miracles to have taken place? But it is a sort of a very political criticism which questions the valorization of what should have been a theological figure for very secularized political purposes, right? So in Periyar's narrative, he is sort of inverting the sort of valorization of Rama as a political figure, and instead views him as a symbol for North Indian, Aryan, and Hindi domination over the South, right? Now, how much of this is can be validated by historical analogy is one question. Whether Lord Rama was really an Aryan, wasn't there a very strong movements of devotion towards Rama in the south, especially during the Bhakti period and so on. Now, those movements wouldn't have happened if there was an imposition, but that's not really Periyar's concern at the point in time when he was talking, right? At the point of time when he was talking, it wasn't a question of belief or non-belief in Rama. It was more a question of a politicized religion or politics which was taking on and utilizing theological concepts for explicitly secular purposes. So in a sense, his criticism is not a criticism of the logic or the aesthetics or the moral consistencies of the Ramayana. It is more a sort of a critique of the manner in which the text of the Ramayana has been politicized in modern times and juxtaposed onto a nationalist and a nation state narrative, right? Now, in this, while he appears to support Ravana, it is not really, I would say, what shall I say, a belief in a sort of an existence of the historical figure of Ravana, but it is more as a sort of a counter to what is being projected as the ideal figure of the nation and the nation state, right? Now, very similarly, you could look at his support for Islam as well, for instance, which I cover in this book. Now, I would say till a certain point, right? If I were to pin down a particular period, till the partition, Periyar was sort of sympathetic to Islam, right? Because he viewed Islam not in spiritual terms, he views it more of a confrontationist religion. So he believed that, or he argued, I wouldn't say he believed, he argued that converting to Islam gives you a possibility for the subaltern communities particularly to confront and challenge their erstwhile oppressors quite openly, right? But having said that, the sort of Islam Periyar was looking at was not any traditionalist or the more what shall I say, faith-oriented version of Islam, but he was more fascinated by the practices which he saw in Kemalist Turkey and Nasserist Egypt. However, he sort of, this could perhaps be a reductive reading on his part. He says that, Turkey and Egypt were able to modernize themselves because they had a monotheistic religion like Islam, which they found much easier to reform and eventually reject, right? So for that reason, he sort of advocates Islam as a better religion. But as we know, in the cases with both Kemalist Turkey and Nasserist Egypt, is that the secularists had to wage not just a battle. In fact, one could even say a sort of mini civil wars with conservatives to secure their position and power. So Periyar, I would say, was being more rhetorical than historical when saying that, Islam led to modernization in Turkey or Egypt. And but eventually Periyar is also very critical of the practices of political Islam in the subcontinent, right? So that is something which quite a few of Periyar's supporters and critics do not seem to take into account, is that Periyar was also constantly, in as much as he supported Islam in his till the 40s, he was also very critical of what he felt were fundamental patriarchal practices in Islam. He was very critical of especially the restrictions placed on women in conservative Muslim communities, and he was open in criticizing that even when addressing the Muslims themselves. And likewise, he also at many places says that both Hindus and Muslims should give up their respective religions and work towards a society based on mutual cooperation, rationalism, and solidarity. Right? And I would say that the only religion Periyar was sort of sympathetic to was Buddhism, but mainly because he did not view in Buddhism a religion, but more of an anti-religion, right? So in the Buddha, Periyar did not see what shall I say, moral philosopher or a religious figure, but a sort of a proto-rationalist. Now, how much of this is true can also be contested, because recent research on Buddhism shows that Buddhism was definitely a change, but it wasn't really, what shall I say, the explicitly egalitarian or non-violent religion that it is shown to be, right? But in a sense, religion was a sort of, for reformers like Ambedkar, and in Tamil Nadu for Lakshmi Narasu, Ayodhidasar, and eventually Periyar, it was a sort of an indigenous tradition which they viewed as a rational approach to life and to mutual coexistence without having the barriers of caste. So Periyar, in a sense, saw Buddhism as a sort of an egalitarian anti-religion, which challenged Brahmanism, and thus, as a result, got persecuted by it. But he never sort of advocates any sort of ritualistic sort of Buddhism, but it is more of a sort of a way to live a rationalist and scientific life, because he tells as in that to me Buddhism is just the use of reason. So anyone who uses the reason is a Buddha. So that was Periyar's very simple sort of approach to Buddhism. But having said that, among religions, Periyar, I would say, favored Buddhism. But if there was an option between Buddhism or having no religion at all, Periyar favored not having religion at all. So as he says that he has traveled to places where different religions are in power, and he says that in all of these places he has seen social ills, disparities of wealth, discrimination against women, and so on. And he believes that no religion is capable of addressing these. Since these are secular problems, these can be addressed only by a secular approach. So finally, I conclude my book with a sort of a critique of what I feel are the excesses of both post-secularism and new atheism. Now I'll just come to this put this very briefly and wind up. See, my main problem with the post-secularism is that it appears as a subtle, sometimes a not so subtle validation of fundamentalist politics, right? So I mainly engage with the works of Talal Asad and Sabah Mahmood, especially on the question of taking offense, right? Because I believe that in a secular society, we must be willing to give offense, or we must be willing to subject historical or religious figures to scrutiny, right? So in England and in many countries in the West, we can see statues of colonial slaveholders or people who benefited from the colonial slave trade being pulled down. Now, while these could cause potential offense or hurt sentiments to the British population or the Dutch population, for instance, right? There is still a space for criticizing these sort of figures, and I would say that this freedom which we have to criticize historical figures must also extend to criticizing non-historical religious figures as well, and historical religious figures as well, because that in a sense is very crucial to any sort of modern democracy. Because as Bakunin says, or implies, I would say, that the myth of God is fundamental to the myth of the state, and unless we can criticize the myth of God, it is going to be very difficult for you to criticize the myth of state as well, right? But this does not necessarily mean that you are demolishing someone's belief, because a true believer will continue with his beliefs irrespective of the criticisms placed on his religion, right? A very good example is Mahatma Gandhi or Rajaji, both of whom were very strongly criticized. I mean, Gandhi by Dr. Ambedkar and Rajaji by Periyar. But they were able to respond to those criticisms without taking offense or without feeling injured or without, responding in violence or anything. But does that situation exist today is a big question, right? Some of Periyar's statements on the Hindu religion were quite provocative, but Rajaji, in a sense, responded to it by writing back instead of, unleashing violence on Periyar or the Periyarists when he was in power. So, I mean, I think that this question of taking offense and whether offense is something central to how we imagine religion and religious politics today is a bit crucial, because we can see world over. I mean, most recent and famous thing being the attack on Salman Rushdie, that hurt religious sentiments is used sometimes as an explanation, sometimes not so subtly as an excuse for religious fundamentalism perpetrating violent acts. Now, we cannot be silent or give excuses when one community does that, and go on full condemnation mode when another community does it, right? So I seriously think that there is a necessity to have a sort of a new sort of conversation on the limits of post-secularism and religious identity politics. And what on the other hand, the problem with new atheism is that it reduces everything to religion, that all the problems of the world are reduced to religion without ever addressing issues of capitalism or addressing issues of racism or sexism, right? Now, for Periyar, these were the key issues, not the rejection of religion. Addressing issues of racism, casteism, sexism, capitalism, these were primary to Periyar. So Periyar said that if there was a God who could bring equality, I would have no problem with him. But wherever God is used politically, God is used to cement inequality, right? So Periyar's atheism was not a rejection of God alone. It was used as a critique of social hierarchy, social power, and the nation state form. So that is my concept of political atheism that I am explaining in this book. So I don't want to go on. I'll just leave it here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to start, Professor Thiru, as the discussant, the first discussant?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Joe, and thanks, Karthick, for this brief but very nuanced description of Periyar's understanding of political atheism. The term itself is pretty fascinating, political atheism, isn't it? So, because obviously we will expect that there is something called political or rather religious fanaticism, and that's where I think it has to be located. Good. And in fact, I would like to begin from where you have stopped. So Periyar was not a very, very conventional understanding, atheist, saying no to all this. No, he was a much nuanced, organic intellectual of our times. But unfortunately, very little attention has been paid to his contributions. Rather, I begin from your the last section of your book, Periyar, for our times. How do we make sense of Periyar for our times? So this is where exactly his political atheism makes a lot of sense to us, because we are in a position, perhaps very precarious situation, wherein we have no idea of how to distinguish fanaticism with culture, fanaticism with bigotry, fanaticism with nation state, fanaticism with nationalism. So therefore, the idea of political atheism and Periyar's relevance to that is extremely significant here, in my opinion. I think that's where your contribution on Periyar makes it more and more important for the years to come. As I said, Periyar is not a very conventional iconoclast or very, very naive anarchist. Understand? Interested simply demolishing all that you believe in. No, rather we all would be very surprised, especially those who are from the Tamil-speaking region of Madras Presidency, would have been more surprised to see that why Periyar paid very little attention to the little tradition. So the entire little tradition, in which the entire subaltern communities were part of, Periyar's so-called atheism or anarchist or rhetorics were pretty minimal. As your ancestral worships, Periyar had got very little to say. Rather, more and more he was interested in the so-called great tradition in the conventional Milton Seeger's framework. Understand? So the great tradition Periyar was quite upset about. Why? Second interesting thing is, why has he chosen? As you know, Karthik has very elaborately talked about it and very, very persuasively argued in his third chapter, Ramaswamy and Ramayana. You see, the title itself is pretty fascinating. It's not Periyar and Ramayana, it's Ramaswamy and Ramayana. So Ramaswamy ended up critiquing Ramayana. What was the reason? What was the simple? See, the simple point is we have in those who are little familiar with Tamil classical literature or Tamil literature generally would be knowing about the 5 great epics. Understand? Silappadigaram, Manimegalai, Sivaka Sindhamani, Kundalakesi, and Malayapati. The 5 epics. Very classical one. Many of us know that one. And you would be rather surprised. Compared to all the 5, Ramayana is quite popular. And we don't have a single temple for Ram in Tamil Nadu. We don't have a single temple for Ram in Tamil Nadu, but Ramayana is quite popular. Ever since the text was authored by the poet Kambar in sometime in 12th century, understood during the Chola dynasty, somewhere else or the other, Ramayana is recited in some pocket of Tamil Nadu every day. we still have something called Kamban Federation. The poet's name, Kamban Federation. Anyway, somewhere else in Tamil Nadu, not necessarily in the temple premises, by the way. It's purely for its literary brilliance. People do talk about it. So my one important thing is literature becomes very, very popular, very important, integral part of your life once it becomes part of your oratory, or rather everyday speech community. You understand? A literature has to become part of your everyday narrative. Otherwise, literature becomes part of only your libraries. So all the 5 epics, hardly we speak about it. But Ramayana, again and again and again, today, anywhere else. For example, veteran scholars are there in Kamba Ramayana. People like M.M. Ismail, a devout Muslim, who was a Madras High Court judge, but authority on Kamba Ramayana. So is the case with Professor Hepzibah's husband, Jesadasan, Professor Jesadasan. He was a professor, but a devout Christian, but he was an authority on Kamba Ramayana. There are many such people. In fact, purely for its brilliance, literary brilliance, Ramayana is recited at least somewhere else today, even today, some pocket of Tamil Nadu, you will hear some people listening or talking about Ramayana. Why Periyar picked up Ramayana was precisely because of that point. Ramayana is part of your everyday narrative. Somewhere else you are quoting Ramayana without having a single temple for Ram. So therefore, what is important is why Periyar hardly spoke or paid very little attention to the little tradition. Why he had picked up, compared to other religions or other religious texts, why he had picked up Ramayana. Both have got an intrinsic aspect with the concept of nascent form of civil society. So Periyar was more and more upset about the way your civil society is enmeshed with religiosity, which is antithetical to modern nation state. So therefore, Periyar was quite upset and angry and outraged by being religious, being fanatic, and being national. So this trajectory Periyar was deeply upset about. So Periyar's atheism was essentially to make you a citizen, make your justice, the concept of justice as an integral part of your citizenship, and making you a self-conscious political being. That's what I call it, a nation or a national. So Periyar's atheism is against. Otherwise, please remember that Periyar could have instigated riots to demolish temples after temple. Tamil Nadu is known for temples. In fact, I used to have in the early mid-90s, my neighbor in the hostel was a devout RSS man from Uttar Pradesh, and when he first visited and came back from Tamil Nadu, he was very curious and rather upset. Every street you have at least 10 or 15 temples, but you still vote for an atheist political party like DMK and ADMK. And rather you celebrate Periyar and his legacy. I'm curious why the hell you are up to. It's exactly the same answer, Babu. The reason is actually Periyar's atheism, or rather political atheism, thanks to Karthick that coined it, Periyar's political atheism was not exactly against demolishing any religious belief or somebody's religious persuasions. It is something more than that. The notion of power, the notion of authority, and the notion of history. Power and authority, Karthik has referred to it. But more important, in my opinion, as a student of sociology and social anthropology, I would say history. So what is important is political atheism of Periyar is essentially to critique what has been given to you as sacred. So the idea of sacred, all that has been given to you as sacred, meaning all that has been given to you as historical knowledge as sacred, he simply wanted to demolish it, saying that creating a kind about it. So he in a way succeeded in making all of us, but in public you are skeptical, or you are a critique, or you are a nascent form of doubting Thomas, whichever nomenclature one may choose. Now that's very, very interesting. So you don't mind if somebody is critiquing your religion, but you profess that religion. You are following that religion at home. So people have no problem with that. God is correct, no problem. If you say why God is right, no problem. If you say is that God is right, no problem. If you say you are the God, that is also not a problem. So what is important is, as long as you keep it inside, you have no problem. But when you profess it, when you demonstrate it public outrage in Tamil Nadu, be it in the case of all these self-styled godmen, Nityananda, this fellow, that fellow, all these stupid fellows, all these characters, clones, why have they been ripped apart? The same society which has enormous reverence for people like Ramalinga Adigalar, or people like Ramana Maharishi, or even Narayana Guru, they have got no problem because people were taught they are not philosophers, they are not religious henchmen, understand? Or some kind of a self-styled godman. So people are, in fact, if these Jackie Vasudev and all these clones have been again and again, mocked at publicly. The reason is simple. This is the legacy of Periyar's political atheism. Therefore, Periyar's political atheism, what Karthik has very correctly pointed out, is relevance for our contemporary times is superb, in my opinion. I think this is where, my opinion, people should reflect upon more, and in fact, develop people's own. Periyar is not free from any criticism. One can do that. Periyar is not one medicine for all problems. No. Perfectly we can engage with them. But what is more important is actually all our conventional understanding about Periyar. He's an atheist, he's a this and that and things like that. He's against one particular caste and things like that. These are all very naive readings about it. Understand? So therefore, this book, in my opinion, is a fantastic addition to the social science perspective on Periyar. And thank you all. Thank you, Karthik.
Thank you so much. May I now ask Ganeshwar to talk about the book. Before I do that, okay, just hold on for a second. I'm losing my connection. Okay, yeah, Ganeshwar, please go ahead. Sorry.
Good evening to all, and thank you so much for this opportunity to share my opinions here. Something that has always fascinated me about the political science curriculum at Delhi University, where I did my MA and MPhil, is that it's entirely possible for someone to complete their political science degree with distinction without ever having to read Castes in India or Annihilation of Caste or any anti-caste thinker for that matter. The political theory paper, which dealt with different debates and perspectives on power, freedom, rights, equality.
Ganeshwar, can you just hold on for a second? Can you just hold on for a second? Nilotpal, can you hear me? Nilotpal, you are moving your camera constantly. It's very irritating. You're moving around constantly, and it's very irritating for us to see the camera moving constantly. So either sit quietly at one place or switch off your camera. Ganeshwar, my apologies. Please go ahead.
No. The political theory paper, which dealt with different debates and perspectives on power, freedom, rights, equality, and justice, had space only for two Indians, a little bit of Dadabhai Naoroji and a bit more of Gandhi. Not only did the anti-caste thinkers not make it to the political theory paper, they did not even make it to the Indian political thought paper. To be fair to them, the difficult dual task of both placing a thinker in his or her context, but also abstracting from their thought coherent theories of politics and ethics is a challenging task and has not been done for anti-caste thinkers for a long time, even for the most systematic and prolific thinker among them, Dr. Ambedkar. Among the new wave of scholarship that attempts to take up this daunting task, Dr. Karthick Ram Manoharan's Periyar, a study in political atheism, immediately finds its place. Dr. Karthick Ram Manoharan, or Karthik Anna as he prefers, is sensitive not only to context of Periyar's speeches and writings, the immediate challenges he was tackling, but also to the philosophical essence of Periyar's contentions, which enables him not only to concisely and accurately present to readers Periyar's positions on various issues, but also place Periyar then among a constellation of thinkers, abstracting from his thought a Periyarist approach to religion, fundamentalism, state, and nationalism. I hope he is okay with me sticking to Dr. Karthik for the rest of the presentation though. Dr. Karthik not only reads a variety of vernacular sources, carefully elaborating from them what he calls the essence of Periyarist thought, but also manages to read them along with and contrast them with Socrates, Rousseau, Voltaire, Marx, Lenin, Bakunin, Sartre, Malcolm X, Talal Asad, and the post-secularists, Pritchard and the new atheists, and Ashish Nandi. To do this in a single book is a spectacular achievement, not to mention to do so in a crisp and intensely readable book of barely 120 pages is an unbelievable feat. What makes him establish this task is that while touring enormously diverse sources, Dr. Karthik sticks firmly to the primary question that the book is responding to. Why did Periyar believe that self-respect, social reform, ending the caste system, and bringing about a society based on brotherhood and equal rights needed the abolition of God and religion? The major achievement of the book is that the book clears up major misconceptions about Periyar from careless, decontextualized, and malevolent readings, and clearly delineates Periyar's position on various important issues. All his key arguments that Periyar was less a system building philosopher and more a system dismantling anti philosopher, that he should be seen as a political atheist for not just challenging the old that is sedimented as religion, but for challenging the inflection of old in the new, and thereby a critique of political theology. That he shared cordial relations with anti-caste Hindu reformers and worked with them, but sternly rejected Hinduism in all its forms. That his advocacy of conversion to Islam and Buddhism was conditional and contingent on temporal social factors, and that he considered no religion as better than the best religion, or all conveyed sharply and unambiguously. As the discourse around Periyar is continuously muddied on an everyday basis by Hindu nationalists, this book, widely read even by people not accustomed to reading academic texts, does a great service to Periyar's discourse, and Dr. Karthik deserves special appreciation and congratulations for this. Having said this, as a research scholar working on the Dravidian movement and also reading Periyar and DMK closely, I would like to request the author to elaborate on a few points that particularly interested me and I hope are consequential to other research scholars here. Firstly, Dr. Karthik argues that Periyar should be read as an anti-philosopher, a ruthless critique of all that exists, one who sought to demystify metaphysics and morality, particularly the political theology of Brahmanism. This is a really convincing argument. This also leads me to think about the doctrine of self-respect in a different fashion. Prominent academic works so far on self-respect have majorly conceptualized self-respect as a doctrine, opposed to Tilak and the nationalist self-rule, insisting that Periyar emphasized the urgency of the former and the vacuousness of the latter without the former. Periyar himself has made this opposition and is of course a valid juxtaposition. But at the philosophical core of the doctrine of self-respect is also an ethical project founded on the cornerstone of the intrinsic self-respect of human beings. The target here is not simply the nationalist glorification of traditional values, but advocacy of fixed moral codes itself. He critiqued everything, Tamil or Hindu, advanced as Olukam or Olukaneri, and declared that there is no Olukam or morality beyond the recognition of our self-respect and acknowledging everyone as worthy of self-respect. This led him to critique not only the institution of marriage, but any moral codes at all that disciplines desire. Is there a potential to see the doctrine of self-respect not just as a moral prerogative over self-rule, but as a more radical ethical war against morality itself? And as a follow-up on this question, I know you've been asked, then isn't there a constructive project in Periyar, or does Periyar have anything to say the day after Brahmanism is abolished? I do not believe that negative philosophy has nothing constructive to provide to concrete politics. Rather, I would like to ask, has Periyar been completely true to this anti-philosophy? Say in his speculations of the world to come, or about the future of Dravida Nadu at the height of anti-Hindi agitations, or celebrations of parts of Thirukkural, a text of prescriptive philosophy, are there seeds of positive Tamil virtues that DMK builds on? Or would you maintain that they are innovations of DMK? As you maintain that DMK and DMK rule has a lot of credit for maintaining Periyar's legacy in Tamil Nadu, what has been the impact of the politics of positive Tamil virtues that DMK espouses on the ideological legacy of Periyar in Tamil Nadu? The second question I have is about an interesting parallel you draw between Periyar and Sartre on the view of literature. They both contended, you argue, that literature has to be evaluated not on the basis of its aesthetic merits, but on the basis of what literature should do. Here he comes up slightly as a gruff cerebral man with no time or use for beauty. Was that how Periyar was? What was beautiful for Periyar? I know that there are three things he really liked and appreciated: dogs, children, and good humor. Here, would I be overstepping to read into the centrality of humor, at once irreverent and subversive, in Periyar's oratory, as opposed to the alliterative, enchanting beauty of the later oratory that has come to sweep Tamil society? As a side note, wouldn't it be more helpful comparison than to contrast the colloquial Kochai Tamil of Periyar and the supposedly elite classical Tamil of DMK orators, as the great anthropologist Bernard Bate does? But more importantly, what would a Periyarist aesthetic critique look like? Is there even a scope for that? The third is a more specific concern out of curiosity. When you have clearly established Periyar and Ambedkar's advocacy of conversion to Islam and Buddhism was contingent on local circumstances and was always conditional, why did you consider it important to survey the failures of Islam and Buddhism in countries around the world? With respect to Periyar's argument that conversion to Islam could entail social mobility and security for masses in Tamil Nadu, you refer to national level statistics and polls to argue that it was rhetorical rather than based on fact. But Dr. Thirunavakarasu's study of Meenakshipuram conversions, which you had referred to elsewhere, the only Tamil Nadu specific study of the social and material effects of conversions to Islam I know, says otherwise. He argues that one cannot deny the fact that socio-economic status of Dalits in Meenakshipuram has witnessed a tremendous improvement when compared to Dalits elsewhere in Tamil Nadu. The second and third generations feels as if they are born Muslims and are fully devoid of any humiliation and discrimination, he argues. I, of course, do not mean to provide a theological defense of Islam as a doctrine, but I am asking if the specific case that Periyar made for the merits of conversion for Dalits at the receiving end of oppression and violence in Tamil Nadu as a potent weapon against caste Hindu brutality not still hold today. The last question, I promise, is about the last chapter. This is an undoubtedly provocative and fascinating chapter. Here you draw parallels between the post-secularist undermining of secular and endorsement of religious politics and the arguments of the Hindutva brigade that also seeks to undermine the secular, but to hoist a supremacist and violent religious politics. You argue that the structural logic of post-secular critique can be adopted in its entirety for bigoted Hindutva propaganda. I cannot emphasize how crucial this critique is, because not only can the post-secular vocabulary and logical structure be adopted by the Hindu right, it already is being adopted. Not only can the post-secularist vocabulary and logical structure be adopted by the Hindu right, it already is being adopted at an alarming pace. When I first read the concluding chapter, I immediately mailed Dr. Karthik asking him, doesn't it ascertain a degree of intellectual sincerity to Hindutva articulations it does not deserve? Wouldn't it rather be more productive to read Hindutva articulations subversively to observe its subtext rather than to observe the structural similarities to other forms of identity politics in order to critique them? To which Dr. Karthik immediately responded, saying that the point was to establish the utter unoriginality of Hindutva's broader political program, how it actually admires, desires, and tries to mimic the Islamic fundamentalism it claims to oppose. When I reread the conclusion, this seems obvious and completely fair. But still, I would like to push Dr. Karthik a little bit for the sake of my own clarity. Yes, Hindu right is obviously cosplaying as post-secularists, post-colonialists, and so on. But isn't their duplicity so thinly veiled that it is obvious, not just to us as critical observers of politics, but also to people at large? Isn't the reason for Hindutva's popularity precisely this duplicitous subtext that is not spelled out and not the logical structure that it proudly wears. If the issue here is not the popularity of the logical structure of Hindutva, but rather the addressability of the caste Hindu society that is hugely receptive to this thinly veiled bigotry, which is the subtext. In this regard, I would like to ask, can we really place Nehruvian institutionalism, which remains sincere to the forms of modernity, and Periyarist anti-philosophy, in your words, which remains sincere to the spirit of modernity, at the same pedestal as potent challenges to Hindutva? So these are the 4 questions that I jotted out that I thought would be interesting for Dr. Karthik to elaborate on, and probably to the commentators here again. And again, I want to thank Karthik Anna for this wonderful book, concise book. And I think I'm really happy to see the book being discussed at many places around the world. And I hope that it regenerates a wave of scholarship on Periyar and anti-caste philosophy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ganeshwar, for your comments. I now open the discussion for questions. Questions, short comments, the participants. Please raise your icon,
Professor Sharma, before that, can I just respond to Thiru sir and Ganeshwar?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. So then I can respond to the question and answers at leisure. Yeah. Okay. Lovely. Okay. So again, thank you, Thiru sir and Ganeshwar, for the very positive and very constructive survey and comments on my book. So I'll just address the main questions which both of you have posed, and the main points which both of you have raised in what I hope will be a sort of a brief but convincing response. See, when I first presented Periyar as an anti-philosopher, right, there was a bit of reluctance by many Periyarists of the previous generation, as I have much respect for them, and of course, but there was much reluctance for them to accept this, as because they wanted to see Periyar as a sort of a philosopher on the lines of Socrates or Plato or Aquinas or something, but I don't think Periyar works that way. I'll just give an example from a sort of a 2 different fields, right? One from literature and another from art. See, when surrealist art broke the scene, its proponents called it an anti-art, right? So surrealist art was meant to be an anti-art. So what they meant by anti-art was that you were pushing the limits of art to reconfigure what art is and what are the purposes art serves. In a sense, anti-art pushes the definitions of art and the very conception of art itself to in a certain time. So does this mean that surrealistic art has no artistic value? Right? You know, the surrealist poetry by which Aimé Césaire and many thinkers of the Negritude movement were inspired actually pushed the boundaries of what poetry can, should, and could do, right? So that does not make them any less valuable as poetry. It's just a new way or a new critique of poetry through the content and through the very process itself. The same goes for James Joyce's Ulysses, which has been seen as an anti-novel. That does not mean that it does not have literary value. It just means that it introduces a new way of looking at the novel and a new way of reading, interacting, or engaging with the novel. So when I say that Periyar is an anti-philosopher, it's not the same as saying that he's an anti-casteist or an anti-sexist, right? It does not mean that he has nothing good to say about philosophy, or his contributions are not good for philosophy. It means that this gives us a new way of looking at philosophy, the limits of philosophy, and how philosophy itself can be expanded, right? So that's just something which I wanted to put about. And you are right, in a sense what Periyar is doing is a sort of a radical attack on established norms of morality, which is why, as I said, right, as in there are many constituencies who could potentially hate Periyar, and these are not just the Hindu right, but the caste supremacists and male chauvinists as well, right? And in a sense, which is why I think the sort of compromise, the social compromise which the DMK struck, right? Now, is the DMK taking the radical politics of Periyar to its logical conclusion? Now, we can't give a simple yes or no answer to that in an Arnab Goswami style thing. Are you with Periyar or are you not? Because politics is always far more nuanced in execution than it is in conception. So, but what we can definitely say is that a government like the DMK gives the space for explorations for forms of Periyarism, or exploration for certain institutionalization of certain aspects of Periyarism, which I think is important. Right? So very simply, has the DMK now, Periyar wanted traditional marriages to be banned. Right? The traditional marriages, the man ties the tali on the woman. He believed that this was, in one of his last speeches, Periyar says that we talk so much about Brahmins oppressing Shudras and Dalits, but in reality, our oppression of women is a lot worse than that, because it continues for a much longer time than the existence of castes. And therefore, if you want to stop this, you must end this barbaric practice of marriage. And do you know where he makes this speech? He makes that in a marriage ceremony. Okay. So now, how do you implement this? Now, has the DMK implemented this, or has the DMK banned marriages? No, but it gave space for the legal acceptance of self-respect marriages, the marriages without priests or without any sort of rituals. So this sort of opening up of spaces, however limited, and is important because it has the potential to expand, and it creates, in a sense, I would say, a sort of a communicative rationality in society where, we can debate in a democratic way on things which are, we have diverging interests, but still come to some sort of a civil consensus. I think that is important. But as you rightly say, the DMK has actually invoked more positive Tamil virtues than has Periyar. So that I would probably say is because Periyar did not have an electoral agenda, right? But when the DMK was countering a powerful and an established force like the Congress, right, it required certain evocations of certain counter sort of myths, if one might say, right? Whether you can call it social myths or national myths, but those were necessary to counter the hegemony of Congress. And in a sense, the DMK was also very innovative about going about it. So recently, I listened to a talk of J. Jayaranjan, the Tamil Nadu Planning Commission member. So he told how this novel by Kalki called Ponniyin Selvan, which is being made into a film and all that, when it was written, Kalki might have written it with some intention, but it turned into ammunition for the DMK to make it as a sort of an indication of to make it as a sort of a validation of the ancientness and the uniqueness of Tamil culture, and why Hindi should not be imposed on such a culture, and why such a culture deserves regional autonomy, right? So Jayaranjan told that Kalki was shocked by the manner in which his text got appropriated by these guys, right? And so, in a sense, almost as though as a sort of a redemption, he wrote a Indian nationalist novel talking about, how the Congress sort of rule is great and blah 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 in his next work. But that work, no one hardly ever knows about it. So, in a sense, this is a sort of a sort of a very nuanced sort of political strategy which the DMK had to devise to contend and contest with pan-Indian, and powerful sort of forces. Now, okay, now since that we are on the topic of novels, what was beautiful for Periyar and what would a Periyarist aesthetic look like? I would say M.R. Radha. Okay, so, and as you rightly pointed out, Periyar's one sort of figure, one sort of theme in Periyar's speech, if we could look at it as in a sort of an aesthetic sort of way, would be humor. And Periyar was very much a satirist. That's an aspect of Periyar which is open for exploration. Periyar as a satirist, because he routinely uses satire and parody to make his point across. Which is why when Periyar is commenting about cinema also, he's generally very dismissive about cinema. He does not like Shivaji Ganesan. He does not like MGR. He's generally dismissive about cinema as such, but he is very sympathetic to two particular characters, N.S. Krishnan and M.R. Radha, and both of them were humorous and satirists, right? So that's a sort of a answer. Now, why did I survey the failures of Islam and Buddhism? One thing is that Periyar himself pointed out the limitations of Islam and what he felt were its sort of backward features, and why it was necessarily not a fully egalitarian religion. So that aspects were pointed out by Periyar himself. But having said that, see, the purpose of the book is to try to bring Periyar or Periyarism into global debates. So by Periyarist standards, how have Islam and Buddhism fared when they were state religions? Right? That's the sort of purpose of looking at this. How have Islam and Buddhism fared when they have state religions? And if we look at the track record in modern times, not particularly great. Right? So that was just a sort of a Periyarist standard of looking at not as Islam and Buddhism, but Islam and Buddhism as political theologies, as sort of certain logics which informed, nation states in the world. And regarding Dr. Thirunavakarasu's thesis, I completely agree with it. In the sort of localized case of southern Tamil Nadu, there was really a dramatic improvement in the lives of the people who converted to Islam. But now here comes the question: did the people who convert to Islam, were they Dalits? Because there was a contestation. As soon as Thirunavakarasu's thesis was published, there was the immediate response or a vitriolic attack on him came from Dr. Krishnasamy, who said that he wanted this thesis to be revoked because Dr. Krishnasamy, who we know is a very prominent leader of the Devendra Kula Vellalar community, who are currently a scheduled caste community, but many of them reject the label of Dalit. They reject the identity of Dalit, and they want to be removed from the scheduled caste list and be seen as a sort of a dominant caste in the region. So there were this sort of dynamics as well. And also, to some extent, I would also say that the Devendra Kula Vellalars were materially and economically a bit more advanced than the other scheduled caste groups in Tamil Nadu. So the conversion and the increase of opportunities, by going emigrating to countries in the Middle East and sending back remittances, yes, that definitely contributed. But at a pan-Indian level, as we can see from the studies by Jafar Low and Kalayaarasan in recent times, is that Muslims are faring far worse than the other sections of the population. So this is definitely a part of, and one could claim that there is definitely an aspect of structural discrimination in this, or structural prejudices. But on the whole, we could also say that conversion really has not given the sort of socio-economic mobility that one might have desired for, right? So finally, on the question of Nehruvian form and Periyarist content, right? As I again, this is again regarding Nehru. Periyar was critical of the Nehruvian state, right? He was very strongly critical of the Nehruvian state. He was very critical of Nehru for his blindness to questions of caste. But having said that, he was also very strongly supportive of Nehru insofar as his commitment to a basic form of secularism and his desire to have some sort of rational society was concerned, right? So Nehru also, if at a state level the DMK had to make compromises, at a national level Nehru had to make those sort of compromises, and I think Periyar was appreciative of that, while at the same time being critical of the limitations of the Nehruvian project. But in the current scenario, I would say that Nehruvian form is really at a pan-Indian level is a bit important to defend, even as we from Periyarist, Phuleist, Ambedkarist contents have a critical perspective on it. And this is why, going back to Thiru sir's point, it's important that Periyar, to know that Periyar was always critical of big structures, right? The state, big religion, patriarchy, and all that. But as Thiru sir rightly pointed out, there is very little criticism of his on folk deities like Angala Parameshwari or Ayanar, or all of these are folk deities in Tamil Nadu. Periyar, usually you rarely can see him criticizing these, mainly because these sort of deities have no claims on state power, nor can they ever claim on state power. So see that by no stretch of imagination can we imagine that Karupanasamy or Angalamman or Muneeswaran will become a national deity or even a state deity for Tamil Nadu. But as Thiru sir rightly noted, the figure of Lord Rama has been associated historically with state power. It's not just in modern times, but also in ancient times, right? So, which is precisely why he thought that is a sort of an ideal figure to attack. Likewise, extending that Periyarist methodology to countries where Islam and Buddhism are state religions, we can propose similar forms of criticisms for these sort of states. Right? So that was my. So thank you both again. Professor Sharma, I'm willing to.
Thank you. No, not at all. Questions now. Please raise the hand icon, or you can write down the questions in the comment box. No questions. Somebody wants somebody to cast the first stone. Okay, let me this is just a clarification. I vaguely remember in my not very elaborate reading of Periyar that he wasn't terribly attached to the Tamil language as such.
Yes.
He was probably even dismissive of it.
Hmm.
How do you explain that?
Okay, yeah. So this is one reason why Periyar is attacked under the from the Tamil nationalists as well, right? That he sees. The thing is that early on in his life, Periyar says that Tamil is a barbaric language, right? So later he was asked to explain, and but actually in the interim period, some other Periyarists tried to give a justification that Periyar said that Tamil is a barbaric language because it has been in existence from barbaric times. Right. So when Periyar was asked to explain, he told that no, when I said that it was a barbaric language, I told it was so for the barbaric values it upholds. I didn't celebrate its ancientness or anything. So Periyar actually says that just because something is ancient doesn't mean that it is necessary, nor that it is eternal. And that applies to the Tamil language as well. So he says that a lot of terms which we take for granted, casteist and sexist terms, so are not only rooted in Brahmanism or religion, but in the Tamil language as well, right? And likewise, he also argues that many of the Tamil Pandits from Yor till those of his contemporary times were not serious about their challenge to casteism, not because of their bad intention, but because of a certain structural limitation posed by the language imagination of Tamil, right? So, in a sense, he looks. I mean, we could probably differ with this because there were definitely egalitarian elements and strands in the Tamil language, as I'm sure there were in Sanskrit as well, as has been pointed out by Sheldon Pollock and others. That it was not everything was not Brahmanical or casteist, but in the manner in which Periyar was responding, he believed that the sort of modernity was that the world was embracing at that point of time was more compatible with English rather than Tamil. So his advice to his fellow Dravidians was to give up this passion or madness for the Tamil language and instead take up English, since it is the language where modernism and egalitarianism can be conveyed.
Right. Thank you. We have a question in the box. It says, is it also because Mr. Ramaswamy was born Telugu, Naidu per se, that he didn't give much importance to Tamil? Even his speeches are in colloquial Tamil, in contrast to the verbose eloquence of a Karunanidhi.
Okay, so the thing is that Periyar actually many times states his identity is not exactly a Telugu Naidu, because they were Balija Naidus who moved to Karnataka at some point of time in history. So they were more of Kannada Balija Naidus, right? And at home also they spoke in Kannada rather than in Telugu. And I would rather locate his sort of colloquial speech in his sort of very approach to philosophy and politics and religion as such, right? As in, he did not really prefer a sort of a flamboyant or ornate sort of Tamil, but he wanted to sort of convey a sort of a direct and a very simple interactive mode of communication. This has actually been covered in much detail by Bernard Bates' remarkable work on Dravidian oratory. So see, because there were many Telugus in Tamil Nadu who could speak excellent Tamil, right? who could probably rival many native Tamils in their diction and in their eloquence. But I don't necessarily would say that because Periyar was a Kannada Naidu or so that he eschewed.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions? I mean, the two discussants are free to ask more questions. Do you want to react to Dr. Karthik's reaction to your reactions? Yes?
I just want to thank him for like such elaborate responses to each point that I raised. Thank you so
Right.
much.
Any questions? Anaga, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Dr. Karthik, for that presentation. It's not so much a question, but when you were speaking, I mean, it's fascinating how you bring in Schmidt and the conception of political theology as a critique of secularized ideas of good and evil. But, this sort of what has become a truism of looking at anti-caste thinkers as sort of drawing a causal relation between the use of reason and its sort of automatic translation into humane and humanity. So, are there resources, philosophical, theoretical resources that one can draw from Periyar or via Periyar to think also about critiquing this sort of simple truistic relation that we draw, not just through Periyar but a lot of anti-caste thinkers. So it's just something that I was thinking about, and I was wondering what you would have to say about it.
Yeah.
See, thank you. It's a great question to reflect upon, because one of the chief concerns of the Frankfurt School was on how reason actually dehumanized humanity, right? So, whereas on the other hand, in India, from Mahatma Phule onwards, we have had a sort of a strong emphasis on reason or rationality being integral or necessary for humanity. Only reason I would say is that the sort of reason which Periyar or Phule or the other anti-caste thinkers were talking about in India was not an instrumental reason, right? So it was rather the use of a certain, what they believed was an innate rational faculty for human beings to question the existing order and to rebel to change such an order, right? So now what Periyar is talking about, when he talks about reason, is more, I would say, in line to a certain sort of empiricist form of verification, what's probably advocated by Karl Popper or something. If something is not has to be verified, or if it's not falsifiable, then it's something in the domain of the theological. So but he does not, but Periyar was not a scientist, or he was not a PhD holder, he was a simple, straightforward critic. But he believed that this cultivation of this sort of faculty was necessary to interrogate and perhaps dispel not just religious myths, but also several forms of social and political myths that were dominant in society. So it wasn't the sort of instrumental reason which the Frankfurt School was criticizing.
Any other questions? You want to follow up, Dr. Anaga?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm trying to think with him, and so yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, let me ask with fear and trembling a tentative question, because my knowledge of Periyar is inadequate. did he so my question is in two parts. Number one, I have read most of your book by now, and the Ramayana thing is his commentary is self-evident. Did he comment on the Mahabharata or parts of it? After all, Gandhi was obsessed by the Gita.
Yeah.
In which he found the surest way to almost everything. And hence Ambedkar's critique of the Gita, the Krishna and his Gita, holds that special place in our discussion of Indian nationalism. Why I ask this is partly because of your remarks about him going towards the anarchist worldview. Yes, the Ramayana is an entrenched, bounded text which celebrates the virtues of perfection. But the Mahabharata is chaotic. It's unbalanced. It's wild. It's dangerous. It's expansive. It's full of irony, paradoxes, contradictions, and so on and so forth. Now, for somebody to be looking at traditions, even if he looked at grand traditions, the Mahabharata would have been much more closer to his predilections than the Ramayana. The Ramayana, of course, the reasons for his preoccupation with the Ramayana are absolutely clear and justified. So I was just wondering, and this comes from a deep well of ignorance, so pardon me for asking it.
Thank you. I mean, I actually think this is fascinating because, I mean, as you rightly said, the Mahabharata is really a chaotic text, so chaotic that I believe certain traditional Hindus believe that they should not have the full collection of Mahabharata in their house. If they do, it was likely to wreck the family. Right?
That's why I don't have one, but I have three versions. Yeah.
Oh, which versions do you use, by the way? Is it the Ganguly version or?
I have all of them. I have the critical edition. I have the Gita Press Gorakhpur edition. I have the Ganguly edition. I have many. I even have the Vivek Debroy edition.
How is the Vivek Debroy edition? If I may, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. No, it is possibly good, surprisingly, given his political leanings. I mean, it's literal-minded in certain places.
Yeah.
I don't think he knows Shlesha or very well, but it's useful. It's pretty okay. I mean, the sad thing is that the Clay Library didn't complete the full set. It still is very good. I mean, most parts of it are still very good.
Okay. Because anyway. I mean, when I tried reading, I found Debroy's edition more accessible than the Ganguly one. It reads more easily. So anyway, so now on this, I would say that not just Periyar makes criticisms of the Gita to the most obvious sections where there is what he believes are a justification of the creation of the Varna society. So he says that look, this is what it says in the Gita, but your Mahatma Gandhi seems to be upholding these sort of virtues, which means that he is upholding the Varna society and so on. Regarding the Mahabharata as such, it is interesting that he does not engage with the text that much, right? He just says that in the Mahabharata, for instance, every form of deceit is prescribed to get a victory, and this is likely to happen to Dravidian politics if we are not on the guard, right? But then again, I would also say that there are certain elements in Mahabharata which serve as sort of antecedents, literary antecedents to Periyar's own politics, because I think in the Santi Parva there is a sort of a chapter on an anarchist commune which existed in ancient India. So there are these sort of antecedents as well. But no, I don't think Periyar has engaged with the Mahabharata in detail. He only engages with the Ramayana with detail and with such sort of extreme passion. And the other thing which he does for a time period was a criticism of the Saivite religion, since Saivism was very strong in Tamil Nadu.
Yeah.
So, not much with the Mahabharata.
No. Any other questions?
No, I would like to add one more point. That's what I have also mentioned. Rather, I became very curious why he didn't talk much about Ramayana, Mahabharata. Instead, he focused more on Ramayana. Please remember, we don't have a single temple for Ram in Tamil Nadu. So instead, the reason was actually Mahabharata, unlike Mahabharata, Ramayana was actually recited by many people on an everyday basis in many pockets of India, not necessarily within the temple premises. For its beautiful literary nuances, people are again and again talking about it. But unintended consequence is that somewhere else you refer to Ram, Lakshman, Gita, Sita, and things like that. So it shouldn't be part of your everyday lexicon, particularly vis-a-vis the civil society. So he was more. There is a triangle we can in fact draw between among Gandhi, Periyar, and Ambedkar. All the three of them were more keen on focusing on the civil society aspect of it. They were more interested in it. So they were, all three of them were. Ambedkar is slightly different. He had some kind of a hope in the state with capital S. But these two fellows were a little upset about the idea of the state itself. So Periyar was essentially about that. Anytime you go anywhere else in Tamil Nadu, of course you are pretty familiar with Tanjavur. So anywhere else in Tanjavur, you just go and see. So there will be a Kamban Kadagam, somebody will be speaking about Ramayana and things like that. You don't have to have a Ram temple. You don't have to devotionally look at Ram. But what is important is the literary thing is recited again and again and again. So that makes him extremely curious. This kind of an enmeshing of civic network or rather civil society with this type of historicity is extremely dangerous, because for him history has to be rejected and you have to recreate something new. Anything that has been given to you as historically sacred one is very allergic to that. So he wants to simply demolish everything, whichever is. So is the case with the Saivite text also. And some of his criticism against Saivite text are miserable. So some people who are people like Maramal Adigal will join hands with Periyar when it comes to anti-Brahmanism. But when Periyar, take them for a ride, these fellows were furious. They said, "What, Ramsamy, you are all along with us, and suddenly you are saying something against Saivism." I am against all of you people. So it is very difficult to box him. So that makes him very, very curious, in my opinion. Thank God, if, say for example, if Gandhi and Rajaji did not write a treatise on Bhagavad Gita, most likely Periyar wouldn't have talked about Gita also. Because of these two fellows who have in fact elaborated Gita again and again and again. Of course, by the way, Narayana Guru also wrote a treatise on Bhagavad Gita. So he had a very different relationship with Narayana Guru. That somebody has to work on. Anyway.
Thank you. Raghu Vengala wants to ask a question.
Thank you, Professor Sharma. So, Dr. Karthik, it was absolutely fascinating to know many things about Periyar E.V. Ramasamy. And while the discussion was going on, I was just came to a thought that just lighted my mind, that if Ramasamy's attack on religion is on the basis of the kind of suppressive or the kind of unequal kind of values that it upholds and the kind of practices that it follows. And just before you were also talking about Professor Thiru was also talking about why Ramasamy didn't focus much on the little tradition. Because my question now is, was there any specific reason that he didn't focus? Because there are still some superstitions and there are still certain kind of inequalities that the little traditions do follow, and majority of the section of the rural areas are still come under this little tradition kind of conceptualization. So why didn't he really didn't talk much upon that with reference to the inequality and such things?
Okay. Any other questions? Because I thought we could bunch a few questions together. Any other questions? No? Okay. So, Dr. Karthik, please go ahead.
Thank you. So the thing is that, as I told earlier, none of these small deities had any sort of presence beyond their immediate localities, and they did not have power to set a nationalist or a statist discourse. So that was one key reason why Periyar did not attack them as explicitly as he attacked some religious traditions. But having said that, you are absolutely right that within the sort of local space there have been conflicts around these sort of local deities, right? There have been conflicts not just between the backward caste and the scheduled caste, but between the scheduled caste themselves, between the backward caste themselves, on who gets to have the primary right over the temple festival, or garlanding the deity, or appointing the priest, and so on. And these sort of conflicts continue to happen in Tamil Nadu. Now, Periyar was attentive to these, but and in a sense, his approach as such was that this sort of village superstition and these sort of localized superstitions would change once there was greater modernization and industrialization. Now we have a very strong critique, or perhaps we have a critical lens towards which we see industrialization. But at that point of time, Periyar was very much like Ambedkar as well, believed that industrialization and that sort of spread of modernity, if one may call, would to some extent weaken these sort of village superstitions. And since he thought that this was inevitable, right, as I told you, he was sympathetic to some form of socialism, and he also subscribed to a sort of a teleology where that would inevitably happen. He believed that these sort of local deities or superstitions were not that much of a threat to be directly confronted with or be given great attention to. So he focused his energies on the big religions and the big gods, if one may say.
Okay. Last call for one last question. Otherwise, it's my duty to thank Dr. Karthik for this fascinating talk, based on a fascinating book, which I want everybody, I recommend that everybody engage with. Thank you so much, and over to you, Sneha.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Karthik, for your presentation of the book, and to the discussants and all the participants for their engagement with the discussion today. And thank you, Professor Sharma, for conducting the proceedings for us. And we look forward to hearing more from you about your future work. And thank you, everyone.
I was very delighted, and thank you all once again. And Sneha, please do send me the YouTube link. Yes, I will share it very widely. Had a great
Absolutely.
Thank you all.
Absolutely.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.